Hey, welcome back everyone to El Nino Speaks. And today I had a repeat guest back on in Keith Preston. Hey Keith, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How's it going?
Oh, things are going quite well. So we've been chatting over the past few weeks via text about social democracy, which is one of the prevailing permutations of socioeconomic organization in the West, especially in Europe, more so than the US, owing to certain particularities of European history that are pretty unique to it, that are in contrast to the US. And one thing that I've noticed in my time analyzing like the rise of social democracy is how it's actually clashed with certain strains of leftist ideology, like namely communism, Marxism, and more radical forms of leftism that have like the state take a much more proactive role in collectivizing the means of production. But before we start this discussion, could you give like my audience an overview of what social democracy entails and what brought it about?
Oh, I'll try not to be too long-winded about this. That's a
Oh, go
complex.
ahead, because I think this is a good way. I do believe that this is a very instructive like lesson for people to understand social democracy and how it differs from like other forms of leftism. So you have the floor.
Well, socialism, broadly defined, starts to emerge in the early to middle part of the 19th century in response to the Industrial Revolution. Because the impact of the Industrial Revolution is that it started to break down traditional societies in Europe. The traditional monarchical, feudal, clerical societies where you had elites that ruled over masses of peasants and that kind of thing. That system was starting to disappear due to the impact of industrialization, and industry was starting to replace agriculture as a primary method of production. And the impact of that was massive socially and politically and culturally. For example, you had large numbers of people migrating away from the countryside and the rural areas. Previously, most people were rural people and going to the cities to find work in these new things called factories. And you start to see the development of large scale mining, large scale manufacturing, large scale mechanized agriculture, all of these forms of production that did not exist previously because the technology was not available. And you also saw the massive growth of cities during this time. Keep in mind that in ancient Rome at its peak had maybe about 1 million people in Metro Rome, in just the city itself, or the city and surrounding areas. That's like a secondary city in the United States today. So the mass cities that we think of didn't exist in the ancient or medieval world. We start to see urbanization developing in the 19th century along with industrialization. And parallel to that, there were a lot of social problems associated with industrialization and urbanization. And you also had the working conditions that the industrial working class was subjected to. And you had the large scale populations of homeless people and unemployed people in cities and that kind of thing. There were a lot of other issues involved, everything from health to, you know, uh, pollution, although that certainly was a problem at the time, but environmentalism, as we understand it, hadn't really developed. So I'm trying to provide a picture of the context in which these ideas developed. And then out of that comes socialism. And socialism initially had multiple meanings. For some people, it was just a euphemism for social reform. You were a socialist if you were interested in social reform of some kind, alleviating poverty conditions or alleviating the decrepit conditions you found in a lot of these growing cities and things like that. And there was also what was called the social question or the labor question. And that gets back to the same issue. Well, what about the condition of the working class as it was in the early to mid 19th century. For example, there's a famous book by Frederick Engels, Marx's collaborator, called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844 or something like that. It wasn't just Marxists that were thinking about this. I mean, the labor question, the social question, generally, started motivating a lot of people to start thinking about these topics. One of the, I have a degree in sociology, and I've taught and do teach undergrad sociology classes. And sociology emerges as a discipline during this time. There are pioneer thinkers like Auguste Comte, Marx, a little bit later, Emile Durkheim, Herbert Spencer. These were the first sociologists, the founding fathers of sociology. So it's in this milieu, it's in this economic and technological and cultural milieu that socialism emerges. And socialism was about how to address all of these newly identified problems associated with the development of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, the technological explosion of the time, which seems primitive by modern standards, but was unheard of in that era. And also there was the breakdown of social bonds and social barriers. In traditional societies, there was a system of ranking. There was a social hierarchy where everyone was thought to know their place in society. And it was based on birth and breeding. If you were born an aristocrat, you were expected to live and act as an aristocrat, and you were bred to be an aristocrat. If you were born a peasant, the same was true. If you were born a craftsman, like you're born into a family of blacksmiths or shoemakers or something like that. And so we're talking about societies that were based on ascribed status, where people were born into a particular position in a hierarchical order. That's all of that starts to break down with industrialization, with the market economy, with capitalism, with classical liberalism, all of the things that happened during that time period. And there were a lot of people who found that to be objectionable. There were a lot of people who were also appalled by the social conditions that generated. And socialism was about trying to address this. Now, you had all types of socialists. You had what might be called right-wing or reactionary or conservative socialists, and they were primarily concerned about the breakdown of traditional order. They thought that the radicalism of the Enlightenment, of classical liberalism, of capitalism, of industrialization had broken down traditional societies and traditional hierarchies in a way that was a bad thing. And they saw socialism as a means of restoring these traditional hierarchies, or maybe not in their original form, but something similar, a society based on hierarchy and rank. There's an excellent book by George Watson, who was an English literary scholar who went back and read all of the literature of early socialism, where they talk about this a great deal. That's one type of socialism. In fact, even in the Communist Manifesto, in the third chapter, Karl Marx talks about all these different types of socialism. He talks about clerical socialism, feudal socialism, bourgeois socialism, and all of that. So you had this kind of conservative wing of socialism. You also had a more reformist, labor-oriented wing. These were basically early trade unions and early labor unions. They just wanted better working conditions, shorter hours, better pay, pretty much. They were not philosophically driven. You also had what might be called radical classical liberals. That is, people who thought that the classical liberalism and industrialization and all that were generally a good thing, but they thought it produced negative side effects that needed to be alleviated. That's someone like Wilhelm von Humboldt, or maybe the Ricardian socialist, or people like that. Maybe even John Stuart Mill started to lean in this direction. Then you had more radical socialists that advocated, overthrowing capitalism or the bosses or something like that through revolution. And you had a lot of different ideas associated with that. You had prototypes of that date back to the era of the French Revolution. You had thinkers like Babeuf, Auguste Blanc, and some of that kind of stuff. And then that's sort of like a prototype for Marxism. Marxism was this idea we're going to have a revolution against capitalism. They're going to collectivize the economy and that kind of stuff. And then you had, the utopian socialists. This was something about, the idea was we're going to create all these experimental societies that are going to be prototypes for a future world. And then we're going to, we're going to basically reform the existing world to death. You also had more radical socialists that envisioned a world of pure communism, where everything is shared alike. You had the anarchists that thought, well, if you just get rid of the existing political order, then people will by nature be cooperative. The anarcho-communists, there was a vast range of these kinds of ideas in early socialism. And you start to see that move and develop in different directions in the late 19th and early 20th century. But social democracy is basically the idea that, you're not going to have a revolution. You're not going to overthrow capitalism or you're not going to abolish industrial society or any of these kinds of things that some of the more radical socialists had. Instead, the idea is you're just going to reform the existing system, and you're going to do it within the context of parliamentary government and that kind of thing. The early social democrats favored things like, legislation to improve working conditions or legislation to improve social conditions or legislation to improve material conditions of the working class. Pioneer, proto-social democrats, forerunners to the social democrats, had policies like the Factory Act passed in England that improved the conditions in factories and that sort of thing. But as you get later into the late 19th century on into the 20th century, you see socialism veering off into these different directions. The largest left-wing party in the early 19th century in the world was the German Social Democratic Party. And this was a party that had been founded by Marxists generations earlier, including people who were related to Marx. But by the early 19th century, the German Social Democratic Party had largely become a reformist party, meaning that they weren't really about trying to have an violent overthrow of the government or something like that. They were more about reforming capitalism. Their rhetoric was often still Marxist, but it was in practice they were pragmatic. They were reform oriented rather than revolutionary. And also, you had other socialists who went in a more radical direction. You had in Russia, for example, Leninism or Bolshevism. And that's when people think of communism today, that's what they think of. They think of what they're really thinking of is Leninism or Bolshevism. And the idea there, that's something far more radical. The idea there is you have a revolution that's carried out by violence. You take over the state, you nationalize the means of production, you create a centrally planned economy, you abolish market relations and commodification, you abolish the law of value and all of that, and you have a collectivized society with the centrally planned economy. That's communism, as most people understand it. You also had other types of socialism that went in a more rightward direction, and that some of that became a prototype for things like fascism and National Socialism. For example, there was a socialist named Eugen Düring who lived in the late 19th century or thereabout, who had this idea of folkish socialism. The idea, well, socialism has got to be rooted in a nationality and a people and a culture. And that sort of becomes, he was a German, and that sort of becomes a prototype for German National Socialism. You also had the revolutionary syndicalists who advocated workers' seizure of the economy and the factories and all that kind of stuff through violence. And then that evolves into national syndicalism, the idea, well, we're going to have a nationalized economy, and the economy, the industries are going to be run by these workers' syndicates, as part of a nationalist collectivist state. And that evolves into Italian, to some degree, there's other influences as well, but that evolves into Italian fascism. So social democracy was more basically the more moderate, reformist, nonviolent way of socialism. Uh, Communists often dismissed it as bourgeois. They looked at it like, well, social democracy is just for middle class do-gooders who want to reform the economy, but they're not really against capitalism, or they're not really revolutionary, or they're not really socialist. And the more national socialist types had the same view. They're not nationalist. They're not radical nationalist enough. And from those vantage points, if you're a national socialist or a Bolshevik, then yeah, you would look at social democracy and think it's a more middle of the road kind of bourgeois type of philosophy. But social democracy in the 20th century starts to become the prevailing form of socialism in the Western world. The Eastern world moves towards Bolshevism. But first in Russia, then later in China and North Korea and all that. But in the Western world, you start to see the emergence of the social democratic parties, who start to become influential, even dominant parties in various European countries. And the name may vary. Like in Germany, it's the German Social Democratic Party. They're still there, the SPD. In Britain, it was the Labour Party. They're still there. The current Prime Minister of England is from the Labour Party. In the in France, they were just called the Socialist Party. And you have variations of this in all of the different European countries. And then in the United States, there was a socialist party in the early 20th century led by a guy named Eugene V. Debs, that at one point could actually get about 10% of the vote in a presidential election. And what happened was that the socialists never became a competitive party in the United States. But what happened is that the major parties absorbed a lot of their program, meaning that if you go back and we look at the progressive era, if you look at the New Deal era, if you look at the Fair Deal era during the Harry Truman administration, if you look at the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson and all of that, those are social democratic policies. Things like regulating industry to uphold protections for workers, like minimum wage or something like that, or something that's about providing for the material conditions of the working class or the general public, something like, Medicare or Medicaid or food stamps or Social Security. All of those are basically social democratic policies. Now, a lot of Americans tend to use a lot of these terms interchangeably in a way that is, I think, incorrect.
Mhm.
Like some Americans will use the term liberal, social democrat, progressive, socialist, and communist as though these are the same idea or just variations of the same idea. And that's not true. All right. First of all, a liberal is an older idea than socialism. Liberalism is the idea that came out of the Enlightenment, where it's the idea of government by social contract, the consent of the people, and so forth, constitutional rights, the market economy, broadly defined, elected democratic or Republican forms of government. That's liberalism. And then what is called liberalism in the United States is basically reform liberalism or social liberalism, meaning not only do you have a constitutional republic or something similar, a parliamentary democracy or something like that as a form of government, but you also have legislation that is intended to provide protection for disadvantaged people, whether it's workers or whether it's civil rights or something like that. For instance, when the government passes a law outlawing racial discrimination in employment, that's a liberal policy. It's not necessarily a socialist or even a social democratic policy, but it's more of a liberal policy. This idea of legal equality, pretty much. When the government enacts something like Medicare or Medicaid or Obamacare or something like that, that's intended to provide for the material interests of the public, that is a social democratic policy. When the government does something like, trying to regulate the amount of sugar you can have in a Slurpee or something of that type, That's more of a progressive policy. That's more about technocratic management. And progressivism in that sense overlaps with social democracy, but it's really rooted more in the whole Prussian idea of, civil service and technocratic management through bureaucratic experts and that kind of stuff. So that's progressivism, technocratic management. And so liberalism, social democracy, and progressivism are different ideas. They overlap. Sometimes people in each of them advocate for similar policies. For example, in our country today, in America, if you were to ask a liberal, a social democrat, and a progressive whether, say, we should have legislated protections for LGBTQ people against employment discrimination, all three of them would probably say yes in today's political world. Maybe not in past times, but they have slightly different reasons for thinking that at various points. If we look at people in our society today who are well known, if we want to think about someone who is a liberal, like Joe Biden is pretty much a liberal. He's not really a social democrat. He's not that far left. He's actually a tool of the bikers. But he would say that he's for civil rights laws and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Civil Rights Act in 1964. He wouldn't say that he was opposed to that. So he would be a liberal. And he might be for, some legislative rights for unions or, and that kind
Would you say that the Squad are like social democrats?
They're probably the closest thing that we have to that in the U.S. Congress, along with someone like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is probably the closest to a real social democrat of anybody in the Congress. The Squad, they're somewhere between liberals and social democrats. Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's running mate, he's a social democrat, I'd say, or close to it. Maybe a fairly moderate one, but a social democrat. Now, someone like Hillary Clinton is a progressive. That's somebody that's pro technocratic. And now, she may be a neoliberal in terms of economic policies and that kind of stuff, but that's basically progressivism. That's like the American Wilsonian tradition. But in the United States, of people who are elected to things like Congress, very few of them are actual social democrats. Most of them are neoliberals, progressives, and reform liberals, but not really social democrats. They have to be a little further left to be social democrats. Bernie Sanders is a social democrat. Maybe AOC, maybe someone like Rashida Tlaib, at least they veer in that direction. But that's not really the norm among what Americans think of as the left, or liberals or whatever.
Do you believe that the reason Europe has trended more towards social democracy compared to the US is due to the fact that Europe has a much stronger feudal tradition? Because when you look at Europe, it does seem like the social democracy does have a degree of elite buy-in because it kind of resembles this paternalistic relationship that the state has with the individual that has some parallels to like a feudal relationship in a way that you just don't see in the US because there's not really like any semblance of like a feudal tradition in the North American continent.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Again, the work that I referred to earlier about George Watson, if you go back and you look at the old early socialist literature, you see that it overlaps quite a bit with feudal paternalism. In fact, even in Marx, Marx was not all socialists were nearly as radical as Marx, but even Marx, if you actually read the Communist Manifesto, at times he sounds almost like a conservative. He's talking about how, we've seen the bonds of society break down and the paternalistic relationship that you see in feudalism break down, and now everything is just about cash for hire and so forth. Everything is now transactional. That's essentially a conservative, a European.
It's like a red Tory. That sounds like almost like a red Tory from like the UK.
Exactly, exactly. And so that's straight out of the Communist Manifesto. So yeah, you always had this kind of conservative, feudal, aristocratic tradition within socialism, for which paternalism was sort of the uh, one of the overarching values. And yeah, I think it's absolutely true that because Europe traditionally has this feudal tradition, has this royal tradition, has this clerical and aristocratic tradition, I think that ironically created a cultural framework for socialism to take root there in a way that it didn't in the United States. I mean, the United States, more than any other country, has always been a classical liberal or bourgeois society, or a more middle class oriented society. I mean, one of the American ideals is the idea of sort of like the small businessman. The small businessman is an entrepreneur, and he's self sufficient and makes it on his own, and then he becomes rich through his own efforts and success. And you don't really see that kind of idealization of entrepreneurialism or business or sort of middle class culture, or what the Marxists call the petty bourgeois culture. You don't really see that in nearly quite as much in Europe, and I think that accounts for the difference. America was always the most classically liberal country, I think. In that sense, America more than any other country is rooted in this English Protestant, early Enlightenment, John Locke, classical liberal type of philosophy. And, you see that all through the founding documents of the United States, for example, or the writings of the third generation of Americans. So I think that was something of a barrier to socialism really taking root in the United States the way it did in Europe, or even social democracy. For instance, in the United States, there's a big debate, even to this day, about to what degree we should have a public health care system. Most developed industrial countries, that's not even an issue. They would, that's just sort of accepted as something the state should do, for better or worse, whatever your opinion on that is. Even many societies around the world that many American-style libertarians consider to be a free market oasis, even some of those places have public health care, like Singapore or Hong Kong or somewhere like that, some of these Asian tiger countries. That I think is 100% correct, that this feudal tradition fed into the development of socialism, and then social democracy, which was a more moderate, reformist, less antagonistic form of socialism.
I'm curious here as well, because this brings me back to my university days when I took this Western Marxism class by a pretty hardcore Marxist professor who, funny enough, was not a fan of social democracy. In some ways, I got the feeling she was like a capitalist accelerationist, in the sense that she wanted a form of accelerated capitalism to like bring about more quickly this clash between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, because she saw like social democracy and these other like progressive attempts as like retarded forces that would not allow for this process to take place. And this leads me to like next question: what was like the relationship like between social democrats and communists at first? Was it antagonistic, or did communists and social democrats like generally align on like certain strategic issues and on when it comes to the policymaking process?
Yeah, there's a lot there. As far as the professor you're referring to, that sounds like a standard Marxist, a serious Marxist view of social democracy. They view a serious Marxist would view social democracy as an effort by the capitalist class to buy off and co-opt and pacify the working class. They look at it like that's the capitalist class trying to give the proletariat a few more breadcrumbs in order to keep them in their place. Kind of like giving the prisoners a longer chain, or a few extra bread rations or something. So that's how Marxists, a serious Marxist, would view social democracy. Marxism itself has an elaborate, philosophical, almost metaphysical foundation to it in terms of historical materialism and dialectical materialism and these kinds of things. And some Marxists are indeed accelerationists. They have this idea, no, the process has got to play out, that the clash of classes has got to take place, and that something like social democracy is a means of trying to prevent that, not fuel it. In fact, if you find somebody who claims to be a socialist who believes that, that means they're probably close to being a serious Marxist. If they claim to be a socialist and they're just about, they want to have Medicare for all or something, then they're just a social democrat or reform liberal or something of that type. The communists and the social democrats didn't care for each other. They never did. The proto-social democrats were always disliked by the Marxists. Although initially, though, the term social democrat and net socialists, later it's come to be associated with what we think of as social, or what I'm explaining here as social democracy. But the more reformist the social democrats became, the more the serious Marxists were critical of them. And you start to see socialism and Marxism and these things veering off into different camps. You see some that basically become reformists, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Fabians in England, and some of that kind of stuff. But then you see others that go in a more extreme direction that become hardcore revolutionary. And they had, the different types of socialists had different ways of interpreting this. Like there were some socialists who viewed Bolshevism as a right-wing deviation. They were like, no, socialism is not about the seizure of power by a vanguard of revolutionaries and creating what amounts to a military dictatorship. And some socialists said, no, Russia can't even be socialist because it's barely even capitalist. It's really feudalist. So they would say that if you take Marxism seriously, you have to go through a capitalist phase before you can have socialism. And then there were, of course, communists viewed social democrats as sellouts to the bourgeoisie and to the capitalist class. One thing that really created a conflict was World War I. The idea that the socialists always had was that, we don't fight the capitalist wars, that warfare between nations is warfare between rival capitalist classes. The workers have no country. The workers should not be involved in that. But when World War I came, what made it possible in part was when the Social Democratic Party in the Reichstag in Germany, we're talking about Germany here, when they voted for war credits in order to fund the war, then that was viewed by many more radical socialists as a traitor, as treason, as betrayal. And then, though, you had a lot of workers from the working classes of different countries that supported their respective countries in World War I. Even some fairly radical people. For even some anarchists, for example, like Peter Kropotkin actually became a Russian patriot in World War I. Benjamin Tucker, who was an American anarchist, he was living in France at the time. He was something of a Francophile. He supported France. So both of them supported the Allies in World War I. And you found a lot of that. You found a lot of socialists, a lot of leftists, so-called, that did support their respective countries or supported one side or the other in World War I, and for various reasons, either for patriotism or some on the left supported the Allied cause because they viewed it as a war for democracy against Prussian militarism, or against, they viewed the Central Powers as being more reactionary. And so they thought the Allies were more progressive, although given that Russia was part of the Allies at the time, I'm not sure how they reconcile that, but that is how the dividing lines broke down. And out of that came actually a lot of the ideological currents that we're more familiar with. That was really one of the final straws that cemented the break between the communists and the social democrats. In fact, the one reason why the communists in Russia started calling themselves communists as opposed to social revolutionaries or social democrats or socialists is because they thought the socialists in Western Europe were basically traitors that had sold out to the capitalist class by supporting what they called the capitalist war, which was World War I. Or they had just become too reformist or too moderate or too concessionary or something like that. So that's how we really get communism as the way we think of it. We think of communism, we think of the Soviet Union, the Lenin,
Yes.
and the hammer and sickle. That communism. That's how this Asiatic communism. That's how it developed. It developed through a break with Western socialism, which they thought was too moderate or too reformist or too much of in their view, a sellout. And also, fascism and National Socialism start to develop out of this because a lot of socialists looked at the World War One and they said, "Well, wait a minute. When the war came, the workers were supposed to revolt and overthrow capitalism. Instead, they all backed their respective nations in the war. So, what does that mean? Well, to some socialists, that meant, well, a nation is a stronger force than class." And Italian fascism, in part, evolved out of that. Mussolini had been a socialist. He was practically the Italian Lenin. And after World War One, he starts revising socialism theoretically, saying, well, no, socialism is not really about the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Instead, it's between poor nations and rich countries, meaning that, in his case, poor countries like Italy against wealthy countries like those of Northern Europe or the Atlantic. So fascists started rejecting the idea of class conflict, and they started to adopt the idea of a nationalist collectivist state to which all classes are subordinated, but then there's class collaboration across class lines. And out of that's how you start to get these ideas like national syndicalism and national socialism and all of that kind of stuff. And then another current that emerges is what is often thought of as Western Marxism today, and that's stuff like the Frankfurt School or like Antonio Gramsci. Like the Frankfurt School was another group of Marxists that looked at what happened in World War One and said, "Hey, wait a minute, why did the workers revolt? Why did we have a socialist revolution? Why did the workers become conservative patriots?" And they started developing the idea, well, it must be culture is the issue, that that the workers have been enculturated with ideas that led them to support the capitalist class during the war. And the workers have been inculcated with patriotism or traditionalism or religion or something. Antonio Gramsci had the same idea. He was an Italian communist who developed the idea that, well, before we socialists can really control the economy, we've got to control the culture. So we've got to win the culture war. I didn't really call it that, but their equivalent of a culture war. We've got to win that first before we can actually have socialism, because otherwise the working class is not going to support socialism if they view it as culturally alien.
I'm kind of curious here because I think in the 20th century, especially during the interwar period and even World War II, you did kind of see a rapprochement between certain strands of communists, social democrats, and liberals to form this like united front against reactionary like nationalist movements, whether it's like Franco or even just flat out like fascist and national socialist movements in Italy and Germany. How enduring were those united fronts? And was that just basically just united by like the fact that they hated these like so-called right-wing movements, or was there something like more substantive behind these like temporary alliances?
Well, yeah, when you started to see the rise of fascism, National Socialism, reactionary nationalism, and things like that in the interwar period, you started to see the left forming these popular fronts against the right, and that was really just a matter of a common enemy. For instance, in Spain, you had a vast range of groups that supported the Republic against the Francistas, but that included the socialists, that is, people who would be considered social democrats, or it also included the further left, the anarchists and syndicalists. It included more hardcore socialists. It included the reform liberals. It included classical liberals. And it also included the communists, but they all had different reasons for opposing the right. Some saw the right as an enemy of democracy and liberalism. Some saw the right as an enemy of socialism or social democracy, and some saw the right as an enemy of communism. So they had different reasons for opposing the right, but it was just a temporary alliance against a common enemy, which led to a lot of infighting on the left. The Spanish Civil War, for example, was notorious for the infighting between the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, the Trotskyites. They were just as often shooting each other as shooting at the Francistas. But anti-reaction was the common denominator in all of that. There are precedents for that that go a lot further back. For instance, during the revolution, during the uprisings of 1848, which were essentially classical liberal uprisings throughout Europe, you had liberals and socialists and proto-communists and people that were similar to classical anarchists. You had all of these kinds of people on one side of the fence against the traditional elites, the monarchies and that kind of stuff, even if they had much different views. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks about that as well. Because keep in mind, the Communist Manifesto was written in 1848, following the insurrections of 1848. And Karl Marx is talking about how, we've got all these different factions aligned against each other in Europe. And he was saying that before we can have a communist revolution or have socialism, we've really got to fight reaction. So liberalism and the hegemony of the bourgeoisie, that is, a step forward. That's progressive. Because they're eradicating the old order, but that's not nearly good enough. We got to have the bourgeoisie defeat the feudal class, and then we can have the class war of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. And a much more watered down version of that is some of the rhetoric you see right now in the United States, where you have a lot of people on the left who say, well, no, we don't like the neoliberalism of the Democratic Party, or we consider the Democrats to be imperialist or too capitalist, or, this, that, or the other thing. But we still got to vote for the Democrats to defeat the so-called fascists, meaning the Trump supporters. There's a lot of social democrats and leftists here in the United States who feel that way about, the current election. Hopefully they're not going to start shooting at each other, but that tradition on the left has been there, for at least 100, 170, 100, maybe 200 years. Even in the French Revolution, you saw elements of that. One reason the French Revolution turned so bloody was you had a lot of disagreements about how far the revolution should go. There were some revolutionaries that just wanted a bourgeois republic, kind of like the United States.
Yeah, kind of like the Girondins, more or less.
Yeah. Well, the Jacobins, you had the Jacobins. They were more about building republicanism in one country, whereas you had the Girondins were about expanding the revolution throughout Europe. And then you had the Enragés, who were like an even more extreme group. And that's one reason that revolution turned so bloody. Is on one hand, the revolutionaries, whoever was holding power at the time, was trying to keep what would be called the right, or the reaction, the monarchists or whatever, from coming back to power. At the same time, they were trying to hold the line against the left, against whatever they thought was too radical. We don't want to go that far. And then, of course, the system was so unstable. No one group stayed in power, and then each group that came in often, tried to purge whatever came before, yet hold its own position against competitors, and it turned into a bloody civil war. And that often happens in these kinds of violent revolutions. In fact, one of the critiques, of course, that conservatives in the tradition of Burke and thinkers like that, one of the arguments they make against revolutions is that this is a common feature of revolution. You might get rid of the old ruling class, but then the revolution just creates a new ruling class, and then there's a lot of bloodshed involved in the scramble for power in the process.
Yeah, it makes sense. Now, moving forward to contemporary times, do you see much cooperation with old school Marxists and these social democrats, or is there still tension between them? Because I do think that there is some room for cooperation between them now with the rise of this like so-called populist right across the West. Or do you think that the same type of divisions are very much in place well into the 21st century?
Well, in the Western world today, there are very few old school Marxists. To the degree that there are any, they're usually in very, very small sectarian groups, or they're just simply isolated academics or intellectuals. Even a lot of the so-called communist organizations that you find in the West today are really what's called reform communists or Euro communists, meaning they're really just social democrats.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as far as the people that take communism seriously and really believe in Marxism as a theoretical system, what's interesting is that I've seen a lot of people with that viewpoint and in more recent times start to take positions that sound almost right-wing. For example, they will be some of the most fierce denouncers of wokeism that there is. Their line is that woke is basically a CIA plot to distract the workers with all sorts of nonsense.
Communism.
Yeah, yeah. They basically think that wokeism is a plot by the ruling class or the CIA or someone to co-opt the left and distract the left towards cultural stuff and LGBT and all that and away from a class struggle, away from anti-imperialism, all these kinds of things. If you find somebody on the left that has that viewpoint, that means they're probably fairly serious in their Marxism. Most people on the left, are not gonna have a viewpoint like that. Most people on the left today in the Western world, it's the pink and green left. It's not the old black and red left. It's the pink and green left. They'll talk about climate change and LGBT and women's rights and that kind of stuff. For instance, old school Marxists would have never been in favor of open borders as far as immigration policy. If you look around the world at actual communist parties that still have influence or that still exist within the Marxist paradigm, very few of them advocate anything like that. For instance, I remember seeing an interview a while back with a Hungarian communist, an old school Hungarian communist. And somebody asked him about immigration, and he's like, "We're not for immigration. The people aren't for immigration." And that's more of a serious Marxist viewpoint, because if you really take Marxism seriously, you would view mass immigration as a tool of capitalism to create a reserve army of labor that is going to have the effect of suppressing wages by lowering the cost of labor, by expanding the labor pool. That's more of a serious Marxist analysis. Most people who identify with the left today are really social democrats or left liberals or progressives or something like that.
Do you see any future for the rise of a social democracy in the US, or do you think neoliberalism, or what you call as totalitarian humanism, is here to stay?
All right. Well, what I call totalitarian humanism is it's sort of the political manifestation of political correctness, or nowadays it's called wokeism or social justice warriorism. But an issue there is a lot of conservatives who criticize wokeism or PC or whatever you want to call it usually have a very shallow, on surface level criticism of all that. For instance, they simply criticize woke or PC because they don't like the policies associated with it, or they don't like the culture built up around it. But they often, I think, mistakenly associate it with Marxism or communism or actual socialism. And that's not really what it is. If you look at the intellectual roots of all that stuff, you can find strands of socialist and related leftist ideas that feed into that. But you can also find religious ideas that feed into it, and liberal ideas that feed into it as well. So woke or PC or whatever is not communism. It's not Marxism per se. This idea that some conservatives have of cultural Marxism is sort of a misnomer because there's no such thing as cultural Marxism. Marxism, by definition, is based on the idea of historical materialism and economic determinism and class determinism. And once you subordinate all that to cultural analysis, you no longer have Marxism, you have something else. But totalitarian humanism is a term that I came up with. Well, I didn't come up with it. I appropriated it from a thing I found many years ago. But it's a term I use to describe authoritarian progressivism or authoritarian liberalism in the sense that you have ostensibly liberal or progressive norms like, social equality among races and genders and sexual orientations. And, it doesn't have to just be that. There's other issues too. But it's done in a way that's in conflict with, traditional Enlightenment, liberal civil rights like free speech and freedom of religion and freedom of association and privacy and property and all these kinds of things, as well as things like academic freedom and scientific freedom and all of that. And it's the idea that institutions and have to be subordinated to ideology. For example, in a theocratic country, the typical norm is that everything has to be subordinated to the teachings of the actual religion. If you're in Saudi Arabia and you want to come up with an approach to medical science or natural science or social science that is in contradiction with the teachings of the Wahhab version of Salafi, which is a very conservative form of Sunni Islam, then, well, good luck to you. You're probably not going to have a good time with that. And totalitarian humanism is a similar application of so-called progressivism. For example, I've seen people who want to have laws criminalizing climate change denial, or in the same way that they have laws criminalizing Holocaust denial in some European countries. Or you have people that want to have severe social sanctions against people who did not get the COVID vaccine. Or you have in some cases, you have extreme ideas like Ibram X. Kendi had the idea of a department of anti-racism that would be like the highest body of government that pretty much has the authority to overrule any other branch of government or layer of government if particular policies were deemed to be racist or something like that. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about totalitarian humanism, this idea of subordinating everything to ideological conformity, undermining these kind of liberal civil liberties in the name of upholding ideological conformity. And there's other issues as well. I mean, if you really took progressive stacking to its logical conclusion, you'd have to have something like the Hindu caste system. It would have to be something where everybody is assigned to a system of ascribed status, and how much status you get is how oppressed you supposedly were, or how oppressed your ancestors were. Now, I don't think most people in the establishment want to take it that far. I think, in fact, in practice, wokeism, political correctness, totalitarian humanism is more like cronyism, just like we have crony capitalism and, all that kind of stuff. We've also got crony anti-racism and crony feminism and crony gayism.
Yeah, I think patronage politics in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But there's actually a really good article that came out just yesterday, or maybe a couple of days ago, in Tablet magazine by Michael Lind, where he talks about this. He talks about how the Democratic Party in particular has developed a type of national political machine whose ideology is sort of a fusion of neoliberal economics, like standard Bill Clinton neoliberal economics, with this kind of cultural leftism, in a way that exhibits the characteristics that I just described. And I think that is totalitarian humanism as it's currently being manifested. We saw examples of that recently in England when they had the riots in England recently, the anti-immigration riots. You had people getting arrested and sentenced into jail for something they posted on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. I mean, and those kinds of laws would like be a modern or the modern equivalent of something like blasphemy laws or heresy laws, or like in like I said, in theocracies, you often have laws against blasphemy, heresy, apostasy, something of that type. And a lot of these kinds of woke laws are really just sort of a progressive, quote unquote liberal version of that. Instead of blaspheming the prophet, you've blasphemed equality or something like that.
Well, I think this is a great spot to wrap things up, Keith. But as always, thank you for coming on. You always bring a intellectual dimension that is very hard to find in these type of conversations. But before you leave, let my audience know where they can keep up with your latest projects.
Well, you can go to attackthesystem.com. That's our website where I'm the primary editor. It's a mixture of things. It has an archive of past writings by myself and others on some of these and other topics. It's also a news aggregate. And you can also follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter. There, I'm mostly tweeting about what's going on in Gaza right now. I'm also on Facebook. I'm also on Substack. I have a Substack page under my full name, Troy Keith Preston. So you can find me all of these places. And all of my social media is accessible from the homepage of attackthesystem.com as well.
Fantastic, man. Thank you so much for coming on. And to my audience, again, thank you for your generous attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.